Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and supporters of the Käte Hamburger Center for Advanced Study Law as Culture, dear Martin Przybilski, we would hereby like to welcome all of you to the upcoming lecture in the forum series today with Professor Dr. Martin Przybilski. He is professor for older German philology, or elder. I would say elder. Elder is older. Elder is better. And medieval literature at the University of Trier. I'll come back to his professional and disciplinary background later on. And currently fellow at the Käte Hamburger Center, Law as Culture. In his lecture entitled Law and Polemics, Religious Demarcation and Cultural Contact Between Jews and Christians, he will present his research project by the same name, which is part of a larger book project. The project touches upon one central focus of the legal culture of Judaism, namely how the legal tradition traces the line towards the other. Thereby, we reopen debates about the identity-building functions of the law that accompanied our discussions during the last years. A very interesting point in the long list of functions that the law has to fulfill to bring a little bit more of freedom, less violence, etc. into society, or more integration. The function to express and to form and to foster the collective identity has never been in the center since only some decades. So it is a new and an important function in order to give a sociological view on what legal cultures are all about. I will not reread the self-explication done by our dear fellow, but try to frame the topic in a wider context set by Max Weber's writings on the law and on ancient Judaism. I'm not claiming any originality in that, but a correct reading of Weber's contribution, and I will be short, promised, because some of you were scared. Weber's appraisal of Jewish law deserves particular attention in the context of his arguments relating to a comparative view of external conditions for Occidental legal rationalism. Why not to give the main power to the Jewish tradition in order to create modern capitalism? Firstly, there is the still to be resolved issue of the latent criticism of Weber's thesis of Protestantism, according to which the role of Judaism for the development of capitalism is under-irritated. Further, the Jewish religion, more than any other, puts a premium on the legality of action, resulting in a unique coincidence of religiously legitimated law and a legally influenced understanding of religion. So I think this is one of the main points. I could go much more into details, debates with Werner Sombart and the role he attributes to casuistry, and that hinders, to Weber's understanding, the rational side of this specific legal culture of Judaism, and what it means, the Torah interpretation, how far it is really different from that in Islamic traditions, and for Indian jurists, just structurally, they were carriers of a tradition, Weber says, in part interpreting the Torah, yet in part also independent of it, through which the content of the official institutes, such as the Levirate marriage, were similarly strongly modified as in Islam and in India. Weber is saying in his comparative studies. It is in turn inner religious barriers that prevent the further development of the Mishnah, the interpretation of the Torah, as Weber said. A dialectic treatment in the style of Occidental theology largely occurred in the Humanity Academy in Babylon, but this method became fundamentally suspicious in the later period of orthodoxy and is frowned upon today. A speculative treatment of the Torah has been impossible ever since. Whether this is true, you might doubt about that. At the same time, he considers particularly developed Talmud law as a barrier on the path to legal rationalism, not just because of its particularistic scope of validity applying only to the community of believers, but also and especially due to its casuistry that was not always free of resentment. I would say critically towards Weber. Living and dead law, however, became intertwined, legally binding, and ethical norms were not distinguished. This is the main point in the Weberian argument against other legal cultures or legal civilizations as well. Jewish law thus ranks among the religiously contaminated legal cultures that feature a distinct impediment to rationalization, as Weber sums up, as a particularistic and only incompletely rationally systematized and rationalized casuistic and yet not purely logically modeled law. Jewish holy law rather displays the general characteristics of a product developed under the control of holy norms and elaborated by priests and theological jurists. So I think what seems to be really one of the main points is that law and religion, in the view of Weber, permeates each other without necessarily resulting in confusion and a lack of differentiation that could impede rationality. In the beginning was not injustice, but the connection between Yahweh and the people voluntarily chosen by him based on a mutual covenant through which Jews were constituted as a political and religious community. Since the content of this contract, the Berit foresaw the upholding of certain duties, an extraordinary double guarantee of norms follows. All violations of the Holy Code were thus not just breaches of orders guaranteed by him, as other gods also do, but breaches of the most solemn contractual obligations against himself. So this connection and combination is something very peculiar of this legal civilization, as I would like to say, insofar as we refer to Weber's interpretation, where to follow the norms and legality can become a kind of religious duty. Well, this is much too long, and I will cut it because I see your presence is fading away. Not yet. No, so he's much more interesting, and he knows much more about this. So just only some elements of the Weberian image of Judaic law that contains, besides those elements of the combination of law and religion on the one side, the element of a differentiation between inward and outward moralities, Binnen- und Außenmoral, that has been important for Weber's reading, what is rather normal for any kind of social system that makes a difference between inside and outside. So that's not something very peculiar. However, in the interpretation, it had always played a great role also in the way to, to see and to look at it in a more than critical way sometimes with a sort of resentment. How many qualifications are needed then to do the kind of work that Martin Przybilski is doing at our center when he looks at examples of Jewish polemics against gentiles from late antiquity to the modern period, and also when he tries to understand the interdependence of law and polemics and other related questions, mainly the construction and persistence of a minority in the diaspora, as I would like to add. How many qualifications are necessary? I think without knowledge in legal history, language skills in Hebrew, Latin, Elder German literature, and linguistic competences, experiences in Jewish studies, especially Talmudic jurisprudence, but not only, historiography of the Middle Ages, and so forth. All this can be found in our speaker. Professor Dr. Martin Przybilski is a literary historian and a cultural scientist. Following his studies in both Paderborn and Würzburg, he received his doctorate in 1999 with a piece on the, ich habe die deutsche Fassung, Clan and the Sudis kinship as a pattern for interpretation in Wolfram von Eschenbach's Wilhelm. Das sagte Ihnen etwas. He subsequently worked as a freelance researcher at the Jewish Culture Museum, Veitshöchheim Geneser Project, and as a research associate at the University of Leipzig. He also lectured on Elder German philology and Yiddish studies at the University of Würzburg. From 2001 to 2003, he received a stipend for his habilitation. He then acted as a junior professor for Elder German philology at the University of Trier, where he was offered a permanent professorship for medieval literature in 2009. He additionally served as managing director of Trier's History and Cultural Science Research Center, and from 2015 to 2019, he was the University of Trier's vice president for studies, teaching, and further education. When asked in a private conversation who marked him mostly as a scholar, it is his teacher in Latin at high school, then experiences in Rotterdam, and the intellectual climate in Strasbourg. In any case, since October 2019, he is fellow at the Käte Hamburger Center for Advanced Study in the Humanities, Law as Culture in Bonn. And we are very, very happy that we have the chance now to come back to some tiny traces of legal cultures that were referred and are referred to experiences in Judaism with our nice and kind fellow who made the wonderful exhibition about Tasvir, Bruckstein, Almut Bruckstein, and with some others, of course, the ever-present Weber, who is also and has been criticized very much, but also deeply studied in that field. Yours will be more related to Elder German literature, where I could give you a wonderful list of interesting and fascinating publications, but this will take even more time. It is really now more your floor, and thank you very, very much for being with us. We are keen to know more about your project. Thank you very much for being with us.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, my thanks to the directors of the Käte Hamburger Kolleg for having me here. My thanks for all of you for coming here to listen to, I'm not sure we'll really do what Professor Gebhardt announced, but let's see. In the academic year 1956 to 57, The famous Israeli historian Yaakov Katz was a guest lecturer in Manchester and London at the Institute for Jewish Studies. Here he completed his study Exclusiveness and Tolerance, first published in English in 1961, and in the same year also in a Hebrew version. In my opinion, the introductory sentences of the book's first chapter point to the core problem that every investigation into the relationship between Jews and non-Jews faces. Quote, "The relationship between Jews and Gentiles is at all times a reciprocal one. The behavior of the Jews towards their neighbors is conditioned by the behavior of the latter towards them, and vice versa. A real insight into this relationship can therefore be gained only by concentrating our attention simultaneously on both sides of the barrier. Every attitude of the Jew towards the non-Jew has its counterpart in a similar attitude of the Gentile towards the Jew. Similarity does not mean, however, that exactly the same pattern of behavior is to be observed both on the Jewish and on the Christian side, for the position of each is different. The Christian is a member of the majority group, the group which possesses political power. The Christians regard themselves as the indigenous population of their country. The Jews, on the other hand, are a national as well as a religious minority." End quote. Thus, one could compare Jewish-Christian relations to a mirror, as mirrors reflect but do not create similarity. And one is only able to recognize that which is similar to oneself, as at the same time any ethical relationship is only possible from a standpoint that is fundamentally structured by a mode of addressing oneself to the oppressed other. Both Judaism and Christianity see themselves as communities based on a specific historical experience shared by their followers, which is by no means purely historical or antiquarian, so to speak. On the contrary, communities of memory, like the ones just mentioned, develop their respective identity and sense of unity through narratives that negotiate history's scope in the present. The fact that large parts of the respective historical experiences could be classified from a modern point of view as ahistorical or mythical, i.e., belong to those stocks of knowledge that are rather believed than known, does not affect the self-understanding of these communities because, as Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson has shown, quote, "Beliefs make the world in a very real way. Beliefs are the world in a more than metaphysical sense." End quote. Remarkably enough, a number of authors of ambitious and illuminating studies on the historical relationship between Judaism and Christianity have, to a certain extent, adapted and reproduced the ahistorical self-image of these communities, in particular by viewing pre-modern forms of society as so-called traditional societies and defining them, in contrast to modern types of society, as fundamentally static. Thus, these authors took the values and code of conduct of ancient and medieval Judaism and Christianity as a given, viewing the members of these groups as acting unself-consciously, unaware that life could be lived differently. Crossing over to another culture or society, while theoretically possible, was perceived as having been inconceivable for pre-modern Jews and Christians, especially when it entailed a change of religion. One of the main reasons why this simplistic view of Jewish-Christian relations in the European pre-modern period continues to be taken for granted lies in the fatal definition of medieval Judaism as a cold culture, as prominently formulated by cultural theorist Jan Assmann, following historian Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, i.e. as a culture that vehemently resists the intrusion of history. In this way, an imagination is promoted that makes pre-modern Judaism appear, from the beginning and at least until the age of the Enlightenment, as a unit that has always existed in its structures, unchangeable, almost relic-like. This assessment is based on the same error as the reduction of Jewish culture to a culture of the paradigmatic alien. The image that the normative sources of medieval Judaism create of contemporary Jewish culture is not recognized as a cultural self-attribution, but misunderstood as a description of a supposed actual state. But even in the European pre-modern era, culture must always be thought of as situational and contextualized, that is, as a multifaceted space of possibilities that always contains more than the sum of its merely normative ascriptions. Thus, the concept advocated by Katz and the scholars who followed him of the possibility of a clear-cut differentiation between varying so-called traditional cultures has been revised by a younger generation of primarily Israeli historians, as summed up by Hebrew University's Elisheva Baumgarten. Quote, "From a historiographical perspective, modern concerns regarding the process of identity development have informed recent attempts to examine degrees of engagement versus separation of Jews and their neighbors in earlier periods." End quote. These and similar observations by other scholars point out the ultimate uselessness of a dichotomous concept of static, monolithic cultures related to the Jewish-Christian relationship in pre-modern Ashkenaz. My second point, law. In stark contrast to Christianity, but quite parallel to Islam, normative Judaism, i.e. the inner Jewish dominant culture, at least until the onset of European Enlightenment, defined itself since antiquity as an intrinsically legal ritual community that is subservient to a specific, divinely revealed and legitimized nomos. There is, or at least there was, no such thing as Jewish theology, although Judaism has developed a specific concept of faith, emunah in Hebrew, an innate conviction, a perception of truth that transcends rather than evades reason, and is also not based on reason, which can never attain the certainty of emunah. The Hebrew word is action-oriented, meaning support, derived from the triliteral stem aleph mem nun, meaning to support, to carry, to hold, to care for. While the Western concept of faith places the action on the one you have faith in, such as faith in God, the Jewish concept places the action on the one who supports God. Thus, even Moses Maimonides' 13 principles of faith were meant to teach Jews what to actively believe in and not what to theologically speculate about. Moreover, they were developed at the turn of the 13th century, a time when both Christianity and Islam were at peaks in their respective theological debates and oftentimes demanded answers to the questions what Jews believed or not believed. Thus, theology is a distinctively non-Jewish concept forced upon the inner Jewish discourse, as is religion as well, being a derivative of the Latin verb relegere, which means to consider or to bear in mind. In the tradition of the Christian theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher, religion has been defined as work on the unavailable, and this definition is still being universalized even by contemporary religious philosophers who follow in the footsteps of a decidedly Protestant theology. By contrast, normative Judaism has always been concerned with the availability of the divine in this world through its numinous blueprint called the Torah. It has been concerned with the all-encompassing, life-shaping program of halacha, to use a term by Israeli philosopher and biochemist Yeshayahu Leibowitz. Thus, Jewish religiosity has always been, and still is, in large parts, proudly legalistic, and textual exegesis has been its classic mode of expression from the onset until recent times. A religion is Judaism only in the broad sense on which French sociologist Emile Durkheim based his definition, quote from the 1915 English translation. A religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things that is to say, things set apart and forbidden, beliefs and practices which unite into one single moral community called the Church, all those who adhere to them, end quote. Although even this definition, with its inherent ecclesiocentrism, does not fully meet the core of Jewish religiosity, which is the lifelong and intergenerational study of the Torah. The process of discussing and codifying religious legal traditions of what is called in Hebrew halacha, literally the way, was perceived to be a continual advancement of the so-called oral law, the Torah shebe'al peh, traditionally also referred to as the non-written part of God's revelation to the children of Israel at Mount Sinai. The oral law finally received its textualization during late antiquity in the form of the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmuds. Yet the process of discussing halacha did not end with it being put in written form. The last mentioned text collection, the Talmud Bavli, quite soon achieved binding validity within the confines of Jewish tradition because, in contrast to the older Talmud Yerushalmi, it reflected the diasporic existence as a formative experience of the majority of the Jewish people, at least since the 2nd century of the Common Era. However, according to religious philosopher Daniel Boyarin, the Babylonian Talmud was not only an efficacious source of tradition for the Jewish diaspora, it was also a self-confident manifesto of this very diaspora, distancing itself from the Jerusalem Talmud and its pronounced Holy Land focus. The Babylonian Talmud's competing worldview becomes particularly obvious in its broaching the issue of a characteristic of Jewish real life that only plays a marginal role in the Jerusalem Talmud, Israel's relation to the nations, the Jewish people's life among and together with non-Jews. From the perspective of Jewish ritual law, the status of the entire Jewish people is foremost that of servants of the sphere of the divine in this world, while members of other ethnic and/or ritual groups should ideally not play any role at all, either in the past or in the present. However, since the historical reality of late ancient, medieval, and early modern Judaism unfolded under consistently different conditions, and since being Jewish as a diasporic experience always included one's own existence as an interdependent category in relation to non-Jewish groups, large parts of the Talmudic and post-Talmudic legal discussion are dedicated to mark the demarcation between one's own and the others. Quite essentially, the means of rhetorical polemics are used to draw these demarcation lines as clearly as possible, as I myself have pointed out for the first time several years ago. The numerous different groups that Judaism encountered during its historical movements within the diasporic space and within the centuries of its purely diasporic existence were constantly brought into line, as it were, with the Talmudic archetype of the other through the reception by normative sources. From the point of view of the legal discussion within Judaism, it played no decisive role whether the factually real others were Manichaeans or Christians. Both groups could be subsumed under distancing terms like servants or adorers of stars, of the Kochabim. Exempt from this rule were only Muslims, as they were perceived as followers of a different monotheistic faith by even the strictest rabbinic authorities. In a certain way, it could therefore be argued that the entire normative tradition of Judaism, in the long epoch from late antiquity to the beginning of modernity, has pursued an ongoing process of othering in the sense of sociologist Stuart Hall, i.e., the marking of members of a social group as different and differing from their own group, as well as the classification of others as essentially alien or non-affiliates. This process is not about actual differences between groups, but about the generation of difference through scales of difference that are defined out of the group itself and anchored in norms that, in the case of the archetypic Talmudic other, can be easily adapted to changing historical contexts. This applies particularly to the centuries of the Middle Ages and early modern times, which had a lasting influence on the so-called Ashkenazi Judaism of Central Europe. The historical reality of legal social marginalization and oppression by a non-Jewish majority was both recognized on the Jewish side and absorbed by recourse to their own legal tradition, which was seen as superior in the light of the history of salvation. The nomian existence of the Jewish people thus depended on a non-Jewish nomos, in this case Christianity, and could even be threatened by it, so that the claim to authority of the majority culture was recognized for the historical moment nolens volens, whereas the religious legitimacy of that very culture had to be rejected in order to preserve Judaism's own nomian culture of solidarity and demarcation. In order to be able to explain their own historical present, which was ultimately perceived as a texture of imponderables due to the constant threats of conversion, expulsion, or annihilation, the rabbinical authorities of Ashkenazi Judaism again resorted to the patterns of interpretation of the Babylonian Talmud developed in late antiquity. And since the Talmudic discussion about the cultic legal implications of the existence of the other beyond the Jewish people had already preferred the means of polemical escalation, religious polemics also became a preferred form of discourse in dealing with Christianity and its adherents. The awareness of the fact that this specific form of polemics was always seen in connection with religious legal discussions within the Jewish community, i.e., that in the end it represented a mode of legal debate within halakha, and thus aimed less at disparaging the non-Jewish object than rather at clarifying the evidence, was, however, lost in the Christian reception of the Talmud that began in the 13th century. Apart from a few forerunners in the early Middle Ages, such as the Lyon archbishops Agobard and Amulo in the first half of the 9th century, this reception started in 1240 with the so-called Paris Talmud process, in the course of which Latin translations of Talmudic passages were produced for the first time, which, from the point of view of the Christian theologians involved in the process, were incriminated in content, i.e., were classified as unnatural, blasphemous, or fundamentally anti-Christian. The immense popularity and breadth of effect of this text genre, known as excerpta Talmudica within scholarly Latin collections of Talmudic passages, but also in vernacular works, which were already available for a Christian audience since the beginning of the 14th century, led to a continuing disproportion in the respective Jewish and non-Jewish modes of reception of the Talmud. Polemics against Gentiles continued to be a legitimate form of legal discourse within Jewish society. Outside this society, the same polemics were interpreted as a strategy of pure disparagement of Christians and as proof of Jewish malice. These rivaling horizons of understanding by no means disappeared at the end of the Middle Ages or the beginning of modernity. Both Martin Luther in the 16th century and the proto-ethnographic studies of Johann Jakob Schuth in the 17th century, but also numerous anti-Semitic classics of the 20th century, cite the Talmudic polemics again and again, as is also the case of anti-Jewish world conspiracy theorists of the Internet age, while Jewish apologists have made many early efforts to diffuse the incriminated passages by historicizing them. Legal cultures are oftentimes results of transplants of legal norms from other legal traditions, which holds also true for Talmudic law, as studies by scholars of comparative law have shown convincingly. Although some assumptions have been voiced to isolate rabbinic legislative and exegetical activity from its Roman legal surroundings. Very recently, Yair Fürstenberg has shown that divorce procedures described in the Mishnah were shaped in active engagement with Roman law, facilitating the use of Roman jurisdiction to enforce Jewish law. Thus, rabbinic law is not merely scholastic, but reflects an active engagement with Roman legal institutions, setting the rabbis alongside other provincials in the imperial legal landscape. So the question arises, why should halakha be regarded as binding law for the Jewish people? My answer will, of course, reflect the stylized self-description offered by the normative sources of the emergence process of a divinely legitimized nomos. The foundational thought is that it is God's will that there exists a certain degree of uniformity in Jewish practices, as well as in the interpretation of the law. This notion is derived from Numbers 15:16, quote, "There shall be one Torah and one law for you." Therefore, even when no formal central authority, such as the rabbinic Sanhedrin in Jerusalem during the times of the temple worship, exists, God has provided guidelines to ensure the continuance of Judaism as a unified way of life. These guidelines provide the basis for the system of Torah law known as halakha. Moreover, God granted the Jewish people as a whole a sort of collective divine inspiration so that they would be able to recognize the correct opinion in questions of Torah law. Therefore, when there is any question, it is ultimately decided on the basis of what becomes common practice, or in Hebrew, a minhag. Hence, when a decision is accepted as a general custom, it becomes universally binding. Therefore, any practice, decision, or code that is universally accepted by the Jewish people is assumed to represent God's will and is binding as such. Even when a decision is initially disputed, the commonly accepted opinion becomes binding as law. Since, from the viewpoint of normative Judaism, the Talmud was accepted by all Jews, by the Knesset Yisrael, the Assembly of Israel, it is the final authority in all questions of Torah law. And since such universal acceptance is a manifestation of God's will, one who opposes the teachings of the Talmud is like one who opposes God and his Torah. All later codes and decisions are binding only insofar as they are derived from the Talmud. All differing opinions found in the Talmud are held to be equally sacred. Still, there is always one binding opinion whenever questions of actual practice are concerned. This is known either from the Talmudic discussion itself or from later tradition. However, when a dispute involves questions of opinion or history and has no special consequences, any opinion found in the Talmud is equally acceptable. Similarly, no final decision is normally rendered between conflicting Talmudical opinions in the case of laws that are no longer applicable. The main work of the Talmud came to an end with the death of the sage Ravina in the year 499 of the Common Era. This initiated the period of the so-called Savorayim, who made some additions to the Talmud and placed it in its final form. This period lasted until the year 589. The sages of this period reached final decisions in all questions that had not been decided in the Talmud. Following the Savorayim came the period of the Geonim, which lasted until the death of Hai Gaon in 1038. They headed the Talmudic academies in the towns of Sura and Pumbedita in Babylonia, which had been founded in Talmudical times and were accepted as centers of authority in all matters of Torah law. The decisions of the Geonim were based on traditions from the masters of the Talmud and were almost universally accepted. Therefore, they cannot be disputed by any later authority without uncontestable proof. With the closing of the Babylonian academies, there ceased to be any formally acknowledged center of Torah authority. However, numerous codes based on the Talmud and the decisions of the Geonim were compiled by influential rabbinic authorities. Most noteworthy among these were the codes of Yitzhak al-Fassi, known as Rif, Asher ben Yechiel, known as Rosh, as well as the Yad HaChazakah of Moses Maimonides, known as Rambam. The work that was most widely accepted, however, was the so-called Shulchan Aruch, literally the set table, written by Yosef Karo in Ottoman Galilee, which took into account almost all of the earlier codes. Since the Shulchan Aruch followed the Sephardic practices, a gloss called Hamapa, literally the tablecloth. I still understand how you can put a tablecloth on a set table, but nevertheless it's called like this. So the Mapa was subsequently added to it by Moses Isserles of Krakow, including all the differing Ashkenazic customs. This work was not the individual opinion of its authors, but a compilation of opinions found in the works of older authorities, which had gained the widest acceptance. Because of the near universal acceptance of the Shulchan Aruch, its decisions are considered binding unless otherwise indicated by the leading authorities of succeeding generations. 3. Polemics. As a rule, the noun polemic is defined by the Oxford English Dictionary as a strong verbal or written attack on someone or something, while polemics designates the practice of engaging in controversial debate or dispute. The term entered the English language sometime in the early 17th century from Old Greek, via medieval Latin, its Greek original meaning ranging from dispute, conflict to controversy, argument. Although polemical word usage is generally understood to be directed against an opponent, it actually aims at the core of a specific group's self-comprehension. In depicting that what is singled out to be alien, hostile, or heterodox, polemics define, enclose, and affirm the hegemonic referential space of the self. The enactment of difference between us and them stabilizes the dominant culture, which by definition does not always have to be the culture of the majority. It simply represents the sum of dominant imaginations and practices governing society as a whole. Addressing historical expressions of polemical clashes between two or more peoples, cultures, ideologies, or religions tends to be an awkward undertaking for historians. They oftentimes encounter, or even worse, get trapped in, hermeneutic pitfalls otherwise unknown to the field of historical research. One central question that poses itself in the face of uninhibited polemical exchange of blows is to what extent did the contemporaries of these confrontations notice the extremity of its verbal and pictorial abuse? Or did they notice it at all? Are we allowed to downplay the rhetoric of denigration that was exchanged, for example, by Christians and Jews in the Middle Ages, by simply following historian Jonathan Ilukin's blanket assertion, quote, "Rhetorical violence against Jews looks very different when seen in the context of larger polemical trends in medieval culture," end quote. And being a result of this assertion, do we in fact deal with sources that depict historical factuality? Or are we rather dealing with mainly fictional characters invented to disparage the other and to valorize the self? So, let us finally take a look at one example of Jewish polemics against Gentiles from late antiquity to the European Middle Ages that may further our understanding of these and other related questions. 4. Zoomorphism. The Sefer Nitzachon Yashan, a virtual anthology of anti-Christian polemics, compiled by an anonymous Ashkenazic author at the end of the 13th century in the southeastern German language area, has the following to say regarding a common theme in rabbinic sources from pre-modernity, quote, "Gentiles are incontinent and have sexual relations during the day at a time when they see the faces on attractive pictures. Therefore, they give birth to children who look like those pictures," end quote. Jewish law generally forbade sexual intercourse during the day or even by the light of a candle, according to Talmud Bavli Nidar 16b. The idea that sexual relations during the day produce handsome children is hinted at in Talmud Bavli Brachot 59b, quote, So this is the quote from Sefer Nitzachon Yashan: "Gentiles are incontinent and have sexual relations during the day." at a time when they see the faces on attractive pictures, therefore they give birth to children who look like those pictures. And then, the quote from Talmud Bavli Brachot 59b, and Rava said, the inhabitants of Mechosa are sharp because they drink the water of the Tigris. They are ruddy because they engage in conjugal relations in the daytime, and their eyes move constantly because they live in dark houses. End quote. On which Solomon ben Isaac in the 11th century commented that children born from such unions resemble the brightness of the day. This notion is clearly directed against any pagan or Christian concept of kalokagatia, implying a relation between a beautiful external appearance and a morally reliable character. On the contrary, the anonymous Jewish polemicist of the Sefer Nitzachon Yashan points out that, quote, most Gentiles are fair-skinned and handsome, while most Jews are dark and ugly. End quote. Jewish author who says this. But these unpleasant external features only prove the high moral standards Jews adhere to, while a non-Jew can be as attractive as possible and still remains a prurient donkey, a notion easily deducted by medieval Jews from yet another famous interpretation of a biblical story, to which I would like to turn your attention now. Chapter 23 of the book of Ezekiel describes the moral depravity of the twin sisters Oholah and Oholiba, who represent the split kingdom of Judah and Israel allegorically. In verse 20 of said chapter, the younger sister expresses her desire to serve as a prostitute to the Egyptians, whose flesh is the flesh of donkeys and whose issue is the issue of horses. According to the 11th century Bible commentary of Solomon ben Isaac, better known as Rashi, the flesh mentioned in this verse is to be understood as the phallus, and the issue is a stream of semen. For donkeys and horses engage in sexual intercourse more than any other male animals. The Egyptians are described in this manner because a woman who is extremely profligate in these matters lusts for men with such characteristics. End quote. This expression from Ezekiel already formed the argumentative center of a lengthy narrative found in Talmud Bavli Brachot 58a. Rabbi Sheila administered lashes to a man who had intercourse with a Gentile woman. The man went and informed on him to the government. He said, to the non-Jewish government, this man, he said, there is a Jewish man who holds court without royal appointment. The king sent an orderly to him, summoning him to appear. When he came, they said to him, why did you flog that man? Rabbi Sheila answered, because he had relations with a donkey. They said to him, do you have witnesses? He replied, yes. Elijah, the prophet Elijah, came in the form of a man and testified. They said to him, if so, he is liable for death. Rabbi Sheila said, from the day we have been exiled from our land, we do not have permission to put someone to death. You can do whatever you want with him. While they were analyzing his case, Rabbi Sheila began, yours, Lord, is the greatness, the strength, the splendor. They said to him, what are you saying? He replied, this is what I am saying. Blessed is God who has given an earthly kingship similar to the heavenly kingship, and has given you dominion and made you merciful in judgment. They said to him, the honor of the government is so dear to you. They gave him a strap and appointed him as a judge. When Rabbi Sheila left, the man who was punished said to him, does God perform miracles for lies? He replied in this way, wicked one, are they not called donkeys, as it says, whose flesh is the flesh of donkeys? He saw that this man was going to inform on him to the government that he had called them donkeys. He said, this man is a pursuer, and the Torah says that if someone comes to kill you, rise early and kill him first. He hit him with the strap and killed him. There are a number of interesting points to be raised about this passage from the 3rd century of the Common Era. However, in the context of our investigation, first and foremost is the inference that this passage states that Gentiles are considered donkeys by the Talmudic sages. They are not like donkeys, they are donkeys. And as such, they are prone to sexual promiscuity and debauchery, a notion that in the eyes of Rashi clearly included contemporary Christians, although the biblical text itself speaks of Egyptians. Modern apologetics, on the other hand, have tried to mollify the harshness of this passage by arguing for a strictly historical approach. One such example was rabbinic scholar Aaron Mordechai Hyman, who placed the depicted events during the time of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel II, which would be early 2nd century during the reign of the Roman emperors Trajan and Hadrian, preceding the Jewish revolt of the year 127. According to Hyman's interpretation, the man in our passage had committed a religious offense and was being punished by a Jewish court. Having relations with anyone other than one's own wife is forbidden under Jewish law, as is marrying a Gentile. This man had sinned, and the court tried and convicted him for this offense. However, this court was not recognized by the Romans and had no authority to punish the man for religious crimes. When Rabbi She'ela, who presided over the court of 3 judges, was summoned before the Roman authorities, he could have been killed for administering Jewish laws. Therefore, he claimed that the man had violated a Roman law and that the court was merely doing what any Roman court would have done. When the Romans decided to judge the case themselves, Rabbi She'ela realized that this man might be punished more harshly than his crime deserved. He then tricked the court to save this man's life by saying that the man had slept with a donkey. However, this statement was not an entire lie, because there is a biblical verse in which Gentiles are compared to donkeys, particularly in respect to relations. Therefore, Rabbi She'ela could claim that he was speaking metaphorically, and the court mistakenly understood him literally. He was not 100% honest. However, he was dealing with a vicious government that was cruelly persecuting Jews. This turn of phrase saved a man's life. It was not, however, an outright lie, and that distinction is crucial in determining whether it was permitted or not, even during those dreadfully dangerous times. Afterwards, this man was lacking in gratitude to Rabbi She'ela, although, understandably, since he had recently been flogged by him and threatened to inform on him to the Roman government. This would have meant certain death for Rabbi She'ela and possibly a massacre of thousands of Jews. Since this man was pursuing Rabbi She'ela, he was trying to cause his death by informing on him to the Romans. Rabbi She'ela had the right to save himself by killing the man first. So, according to Hyman's strictly historical approach, it becomes evident that Rabbi She'ela did not mean the equation between Gentiles and donkeys literally, and that those who claim he did are guilty of reading an historical episode overly literal. However, his interpretation is in itself a wishful apologetic historicization in a doubled respect. First of all, his reconstruction of the historical setting is flawed. Rabbi She'ela and his story clearly do not deal with Romans of the early 2nd century, but with Persians of the 3rd century, as becomes evident by Parthian loanwords as harmana for government and peristaka for orderly. And secondly, which is of even greater importance for my talk today, the Talmudic passage has not been read as being restricted to a certain group of non-Jews or to a certain historical setting. On the contrary, it seems to have specifically appealed to exegetes and polemicists of the European Middle Ages as a timeless definition of the essential nature of non-Jews. In his commentary, Rashi, for example, combines his consent to Rabbi She'ela's actions with a hint to another Talmudic passage, which actually occurs 2 times in the Bavli. Quote, Rav Yehuda said, "It is forbidden to recite the Shema prayer in front of a naked Gentile." Why does he say a Gentile? It is also forbidden in front of a Jew. In front of a Jew, it is obvious that it is forbidden. However, in front of a Gentile, one might say that since it says, "Whose flesh is the flesh of donkeys," they are donkeys. He came to teach us that they are also considered nakedness. End quote. Although Jews and non-Jews share the same physical body on an outside level, Jewish and non-Jewish nakedness is to be taken as equivalent with regard to practical halakhic implications. There nevertheless remains the essential distinction between a human body trapped in animal desires and a human body serving as a mere vessel to an angelic soul. So the verse in Ezekiel, while stated regarding Egyptians, was generally understood as referring to all Gentiles who only appear as being human from the outward, while they are inwardly restricted to the moral level of mindless beasts. Rashi, in his commentary to Talmud Bavli Ketuvot 3b, appears to have been especially interested in the halakhic inferences resulting from these fundamental differences. Jews and Gentiles are maritally and sexually incompatible. As has been noted before, the Hebrew Bible tells us that it is forbidden for Jews to marry Gentiles. The verse in Ezekiel, however, is coming to tell us that a Jew who marries or sleeps with a Gentile while violating religious law is not legally accomplishing anything. The marriage or relations have no legal standing and no divorce is necessary. Normally, when a married woman has an affair, the woman is forbidden both to return to her husband and to marry her lover after divorcing her husband. However, since relations with a Gentile have no legal standing, a woman who has had an affair with a Gentile can subsequently marry her lover if he converts to Judaism. This is because there is a legal incompatibility which makes marriage or relations with a Gentile, while still forbidden, legally ineffective. This is the halakhic message of the verse in Ezekiel. Just like relations with a donkey have no legal standing except for the punishment for the act, and cannot cause marriage or separate lovers, so too relations with a Gentile. Halakhically, they are both in the same category. In my opinion, there could have been a very specific reason why the description of non-Jews as donkeys appeared especially appealing or even plausible to Jews living in Christian countries in the Middle Ages. The special significance of the donkey in contemporary Christian majority culture. The palm donkey was a Palm Sunday processional figure depicting Jesus riding a donkey. It was a genuine part of processions held by the church, especially in southern Germany. The attendees accompanied the procession with green twigs, singing hymns evoking Jesus' solemn entrance to Jerusalem on a donkey's back. Its celebration can be backed by sources since the 7th century, and from the 10th century onwards, village priests are reported to have taken part riding a donkey. The Vita Sancti Ualdarici, the oldest biography of Bishop Ulrich I of Augsburg, written in the last quarter of the 10th century, describes how the bishop participated in the Palm Sunday procession, emulating Jesus' entrance to Jerusalem. The donkey's obstinate behavior, in many reported cases, seems to have promoted a change in symbolic practices, replacing the real donkey and the real priest impersonating Jesus by a wooden donkey and a wooden figure of Jesus. This positive connection of the human portion of the Christian Trinity could have been interpreted in a much less favorable manner by contemporary non-Christians, especially by the Jews living in the vicinity of these annually recurring public spectacles. We have to take in mind the donkey's negative moral image, reflected in the passage from the book of Ezekiel and its later rabbinic exegesis, connecting the donkey's hypersexuality with the assumed hypersexuality of non-Jews. And we have to take into account the fact that a negative connection drawn between the incarnate Christian deity on the one hand and a donkey on the other hand was nothing particularly new. In fact, it had been a common point of contention between Christians, Jews, and pagans since late antiquity. Thus, not only the non-Jews as a whole, or in our case the Christians as a specific group of non-Jews, could be associated with the image of the donkey and its implications of sexual promiscuity, but also the deified human being these non-Jews idolized. This connection was on the one hand another demonstration of the implausibility of Christianity's Trinitarian dogma from a Jewish point of view, on the other hand, another demonstration of the depraved nature of the impostor himself who stood at the center of Christian religious veneration. Jesus' specific low standards of morale as a whole and of chastity in particular were common knowledge in Jewish sources in pre-modernity. Thus, the connection between himself and the donkey were practically self-explanatory from a halachic polemic point of view. Thank you very much for your attention.